patience. System change is hard, it takes time, and I'm going to touch on that in my project. So thank you for the introduction. A little bit more about my background. So I'm a computer scientist by training. So my entry into design was as an outsider, but I'm comfortable with being outsider, and I think there's benefits to that sometimes, and there's also difficulties. But anyway, a lot of my work involves going into the community and working with community partners. So these are some photos of the many amazing students, both at high school level and undergrad, graduate, Ph.D. at all levels that I've been working at in the past few years. And some of these are at our university. So we do have fabrication facilities, laser cutters, 3D printers, etc., similar to the makerspace in the back or fabrication lab in the back here. But also a lot of them are in community spaces. So you see some wet lab activity kind of happening, and that's not in my lab. And a lot of times I feel like for people who have a lot of interests, access to resources, one way is to kind of try to get those resources yourself, but potentially a better way is to have friends who have access to those resources and create this economy of kind of giving back and forth. And I'm always kind of inviting community partners to come and use our facilities and vice versa. I have a few hats. The main one that I'm going to talk about, or I'm going to lean into today, is being an assistant professor in information systems and human-centered computing, which is our specialized graduate program. But I also am the director of the Designing Participatory Futures Lab, and a lot of these activities that you see come from there. Also, I'm the director of our ISRC, which is Interactive Systems Research Center. And this is a university level or a departmental research center. So kind of used to be very much kind of limited to our department within the university. But one of my goals is to kind of open it up and expand it to other universities in the area and also to community partners. I'm happy to talk about any of these outside of the, after this talk, basically, if you're interested. So the overarching theme of my research is community-based participatory design. So as we've heard a lot this morning, I think a lot of you are familiar with different kind of traditions within design. And participatory design, this is a specific one that I'm kind of drawing on a lot, has roots in Northern Europe. And it kind of started from the workplace. So very different contexts from a lot of the places that I work with. So community spaces, after school, learning programs, and so on. So there's a lot of translation work that needs to happen and a lot of reflection on what are some of the values that were kind of informing this type of work before and how much of them are still relevant or have to be retaught when we go into these spaces. I'm just going to talk mostly about one of my projects that I feel is most relevant to today's to this conference. But I just wanted to mention a few of the other ones in case anybody's interested. Happy to talk with you afterwards, and also there's information in my website about that. So this was my PhD work. As you notice, and it might hopefully it's clear from the image, it contains a living mushroom colony. It's actually edible too. But I mentioned that I'm a computer scientist by training, and it took a lot of convincing my PhD committee to kind of make them agree that actually growing mushrooms can count as computer science. What I was doing there was I was basically visualizing data for kids using this living organism. And there's kind of different, and I was looking to see what is the qualitative characteristics of this experience, especially in a family setting. So what kind of conversations it creates, what kind of dynamics it creates, and so on. That's a general area of biodesign, but I also became very interested in bioart and specifically genetically modifying organisms for artistic purposes. I'm happy to talk if anybody's interested about that later, but I'm not going to focus on that now. Other areas of research that I'm interested in is community internet. So when COVID hit, actually in our city, in Baltimore, Maryland, there's thousands of households that still don't have broadband internet. And at the height of COVID, there were multiple kids who had to attend classes. There were parents who were trying to find resources about health information or attend meetings and so on. And they were all in this one house that didn't have broadband internet. And you can imagine what kind of equity issues it brought up. So I collaborated with a community partner to address some of those through DIY, do-it-yourself, not big internet service provider connectivity. A lot of my work has been, and I'm again not going to talk about it a lot here, but designing assistive technologies for and with people with disabilities. It's a very interesting design space and also very challenging because actually the artifacts are not the challenge. It's about the ecosystem and the infrastructure that enables equitable and easy access to these systems. These are a little bit more computer sciencey. I'm interested in inclusive privacy. So a lot of our devices and services collect data. What does that mean from diverse user perspectives? And also, I'm very interested in questions of intersectionality and gender and sexuality. So for example, one of my research projects was around gender recognition systems, which can be really problematic because they often have a binary underlying model, which can be exclusionary for non-binary or trans individuals. But I'm kind of exploring that area and its intersection also with disability, in case anybody's interested. However, today I would like to focus on equity-based making in multiple ways. So I think everybody's familiar with the idea of maker movement, making, do-it-yourself movement. There's different kind of terms, but just very broadly, making refers to the practice of mostly amateur engagement with designing, creating, fabricating, and sharing self-directed projects. So a lot of times, for example, with Maker Faire, it's an event where a lot of people who identify as makers or amateur designers, they kind of bring the things that they have created and they share with each other. Often, historically, when we think of making, we might think of robotics or 3D printing or things like that. However, there's a lot of pushback on that because that identification can be very exclusionary. Because how do we define what is making? Kind of similar to design, like how do we define the formal design process versus the everyday design that people are engaging in? The reason I'm interested in making is that, and it's kind of related practices, is that there's a lot of research that shows that making actually has a lot of potential for learning outcomes, especially in after-school programs, in kind of out-of-school time experiences. So it could be summer camps, it could be, as I said, after-school programs, but also in the context of museums and science centers and so on. And it can support a lot of different outcomes like STEM interests, identity, and job readiness, etc. So in education research, for those of you who kind of apply to AZEL, for example, or other NSF programs, these are important outcomes that we need more research to understand how to explore them. As I alluded a little bit earlier, making has an equity problem. There's many excellent research projects that have looked at this. These are some of my favorite ones. Sharon Busuli and Paula Cooper and Meg Scuddy, they wrote a paper that was really instrumental to this project around making through the lens of cultural and power. And it was questioning how we define a maker and how the history of not counting the amazing creative work that often people of color, non-male identifying individuals and individuals in low resource contexts are not identified as making or as creative. She also points out, she and her co-authors also point out the idea, the myth of the individual, kind of individual innovator or individual maker, kind of going into these practices to the detriment of understanding the social nature of learning. And so that's another kind of fundamental issue here. And finally, where making takes place is another problem. So earlier we heard about place-based design and thinking about where things happen. And making often has happened in places with a lot of resources that often exist in neighborhoods, in areas where there's a concentration of resources to the detriment. Universities, exactly. And we kind of want to question that, trouble that, change that. Design Justice is a fantastic book. Many amazing ideas around what's wrong with like the traditional ways of doing design and how can we change that? What are the possibilities going forward? Highly recommended. It has a fantastic chapter also on makerspaces, fabrication labs. And a little bit older book, Dr. Calabresi-Burton has done a lot of work around equity-based learning in the context of STEM classroom. So, in this project, she talks about working with homeless children and teaching them chemistry and how she kind of draw on their interest to engage them. This really kind of inspired a lot of the work that we did. So, the project I want to share about today, very much inspired by the work that I mentioned, is an approach developed by my long-term community partner. I started working with them the day I moved to Baltimore for a postdoc. So actually, before going to the university, I went to them thanks to my mentor, who kind of really valued the importance of community partnerships. And then I went to the university. And since then, I've been working with them on 4 or 5 different projects. So this approach is a holistic, scaffolded approach that basically aims to build accessible, inclusive infrastructure for community partners to enable making for underserved communities. My community partner, Digital Harbor Foundation, has been serving youth in Baltimore City for the past 7 years, maybe 8 years, about 5,000, 6,000 youth, including during COVID. And they were actually set up in an underused rec center. So in Maryland, like similar areas in the United States, we have a strong tradition of rec centers being important hubs for the community. So a lot of youth come there to practice, to get into sports, to connect with each other. Inviting spaces that youth are treated holistically, meaning that they're treated as full human beings. So food and transportation and these things are taken into account. It's not just the sports activities that they're doing there. So there's opportunities to use these spaces for engaging youth also with technology-rich learning. Of course, it has to be done very carefully because we don't want to disrupt the relationships and the nature of the work that is being already done in these rec centers. But the experience here was very successful in the sense that DHF was able to kind of set up their space in a rec center, and then they created this program to spread to enable the creation of infrastructure in other spaces. Another piece that we focused on is that a lot of research on making is about individual student learning. And as I mentioned, learning is often and should be a social activity. And so the role of educators, and specifically community educators, so educators who might not have received training for teaching or for design or for technology, is really important. They bring amazing strengths to the table, and we wanted to understand them in order to be able to support some of these strategies. So we developed different methods of curriculum, basically, that included both technical material and teaching material, but also specifically questions about equity to communicate to our educators and prepare them for delivering these programs. I loved seeing the earlier presentation with photos of maps. I'm also a big fan of maps and placemaking. This is a map of Baltimore. If you're familiar with the city, you probably recognize it. And there's actually a very interesting historical phenomenon happening here. So this is what we Dr. Lawrence Brown has called the black butterfly and the white L. Black butterfly is these 2 areas to the west and east of Baltimore, and white L is this area in the middle. And essentially, the black butterfly corresponds to historically redlined areas. So this is where there's a high concentration of African American and Hispanic populations. And this white L is where the majority white population live. And if you look at any map of Baltimore, so map of police arrests, map of crime, map of infrastructure issues, spending, you see this pattern consistently. And because of this, and this is because those policies that were really kind of officially, they were actually applied and handed down by the federal government in the early to mid actually 20th century, they still have implication to this day. So a lot of the services and maker spaces and fabrication labs and so on, they exist in this white L to this day. And part of our motivation was how can we disrupt this? How can some of the rec centers that are in these other areas, and especially the South too, kind of be sites of technology-rich learning. And it's something to talk about infrastructure, it's something else to set it up. So we were able to kind of define and propose this to the National Science Foundation, who provided us with funding to be able to set up the spaces and actually pay the staff who were going to deliver the programs. Because, I mean, otherwise these spaces would not have the resources needed. Another piece that was really important was that we partnered with Department of Rec and Parks in Baltimore City, and also we worked with Pittsburgh, which is kind of similar in some ways historically to Baltimore, because we wanted to look to see what are some of the local characteristics of these cities that are going to emerge when we deliver programs there. So this is a research study. Of course, National Science Foundation was very interested in the research side of things. And we had 4 participating sites, 2 in Baltimore, 2 in Pittsburgh. And we recruited 4 community educators. This has now increased in number to about 8, I believe. 5 administrators, so people who manage these programs long term, and about 50 youth participated in this program. Now, this was all done and proposed to National Science Foundation, I think it was 2019, and we received the award in early 2020. So everything was designed to be in person. Everything was from the material to the instruction to, and some of our earlier findings, we had a pilot study for this, really clearly showed that in-person training, especially for the educators, was really important. We couldn't just say, oh, we're gonna move everything online. So, and this is what Rachel mentioned about patience and having trust in the community partners, because literally for months we were on Zoom calls and we were like, okay, what are we gonna do? We probably have to wait. and it's really hard to have that relationship, because with budgets and money kind of provided to us, there's always a timeline. We can't just sit on that. We have to spend it by a certain amount of time, and we have to have results. However, the trusting relationship that we had with the community partners and with the other stakeholders here enabled us to kind of have that patience and resiliency to wait until we were actually able to slowly roll out the programs. So anyway, once COVID kind of started to, I guess, I don't know, it has not disappeared yet, but it's kind of a little bit, the conditions are a bit more relaxed. We were able to conduct observations, interviews, surveys, participatory design sessions. So you see a lot of qualitative methods here. And my students are really the champions here in terms of collecting all this data in order to look to see what are the strategies. So I know that this session we're going to talk about strategies and storytelling. I'm going to save a lot of the stories for the paper just because of time. There's an upcoming paper that is coming out next month at CHI conference about our research, and I'm happy to share a preprint of it with anybody who's interested. And there's a lot of stories about what happened at these maker spaces and these technology-rich learning sites that kind of connect to what we were talking about. But I want to here kind of focus a little bit higher level on some of the strategies that we found our educators use, and maybe use one or two stories just to kind of make them more concrete. So one of the things that we found, and this might seem really obvious, but actually documenting it is really important, is that a key is identifying and incorporating youth interest. When I was talking about making previously, a lot of the maker activities and and the tools and processes are often top-down. They're handed down by people who the youth might not relate to. And also the lifestyles, the resources, the histories are very different from what they're familiar with. So a lot of our educators, they basically signal to the youth that this is a safe space to express yourself, to share your interests, and we can work with robot, we can make a robot. But if you want to like write graffiti, or if you want to work with hip hop or comic, or whatever you want, like just let's work with that. Another thing that we saw, which was really important, was that educators prioritized creating comfort and encouraging authenticity. Now, what it means is that the educators actually were very brave, because I mean, I've run workshops with youth. I know that many of you might have this experience. It takes a lot of courage to be authentic with youth, because they will push back, and they will kind of push your buttons, and they want to see who you are. Like, they have this ways of, and our participants were open to that. They kind of put themselves out there, and there were situations where conflict came up. But out of conflict can beautiful things happen. So an example of that was one of the educators was talking about making jokes in the class or in the session to kind of break the seriousness of it and kind of create encouragement. But there was a youth who kept making fun of him. And he kind of basically sat down with him and told that this is hurtful. If you keep making fun, we can make the learning happen. And actually that created a space where the youth came and told him later that he was actually bullied in school. And then all of that group kind of sat down and watched some videos about bullying and shared experience. It completely transformed that space. And in his words, creating this safe space of trusting is contagious. Like, once you're able to kind of create those initial connections and make the youth be comfortable to talk with each other, it kind of takes over the whole space. It's just that initial breaking of the ice that's really hard. There was an important piece about sharing identity. So a lot of our educators, they were doing certain things that were very subtle. They wouldn't go out there and say, oh, these are my interests. What's your interest? They would kind of pay attention. So for example, there was a youth who was watching horror films kind of before, or horror clips before sessions started. And so the educator noticed that. And then he kind of signaled that, oh, I'm actually also like this kind of genre or comic books or things like that. And then the youth was very interested, and they were actually focused their project on that. Also, our educators being from the community, they're familiar with the challenges and the culture in the community. And so they are able to authentically connect with our youth in these programs. Final point I want to say is that rec centers, at least in Maryland, and I know that different places have different cultures, are places, as I mentioned, of community activities. So the culture is kind of more informal than, especially in the school system, the formal school system in Maryland. There's some tension between the formal methods of learning, formal quote unquote, and the way that youth become comfortable and kind of facilitate learning. And we saw that the rec centers can create this, by changing the setting and changing the culture, it kind of opens up new spaces for innovation. There's many examples of projects that the youth did, and we have that in the paper. The paper has a lot of material, so as I said, I won't go through them, but one of our educators made this quote that they could see youth 4 being maybe the next Rob Zombie filmmaker or something like that. It's like you understand their imagination, you don't stifle it. And it kind of, I think the morning session we were talking about not teaching, but unleashing. And I think that's kind of some of the things that they're working with. Now, we have this very big and complex model of what happened at different levels, and we did a lot of analysis of this data. I'm not going to go into it, but there is basically recommendations for how similar programs can be set up. And if you kind of look at, and basically what we're trying to do with this model is identify conceptual ideas and kind of practices and connect them to outcomes and see what are some strategies that work, what were some of the results that came out, and at different levels. So at the administrative level, the educator level, impact on youth engagement, youth experiences, and youth outcomes. Just as a kind of a small example of that, when we were training our educators in equity-based pedagogy, we basically were giving them license to talk about their interests and recognize the creativity that youth are expressing, even if it's in ways that are not traditionally identified as creativity. And this actually kind of set up different or supported some of the strategies that they did. So for example, they inquired and they paid attention to youth's interests. They embodied signals of authenticity, for example, through their fashion or through examples that they were sharing. And also, they kind of communicated a shared set of values with the youth. And these kind of resulted in a youth kind of seeing their values reflected or their interests reflected in the space. And then it kind of led to learning, comfort, sense of belonging, all the things that we were excited to see coming out of it. I think that a big part of it is that, I guess my PhD student who really led this research, Erin Higgins, kind of was mentioning a lot that the biggest learning outcome was a sense of community within between the youth and also between the youth and the educators. And that was something that kind of led to everything else. So that was really core there. So we're...
I'm sorry, can you say that again? The core outcome?
Yeah, the core outcome was supporting a sense of community between the youth and the educators, and between the youth themselves. So that was kind of something that led, because if the sense of community, like initially when the youth were coming to the sessions, it felt like there was a disconnect between the youth with each other, with the educators, and a lot of it is about the historical challenges with authority, with power, and these strategies kind of bridge that. And I think, in my mind, these are not new ideas, and I was...
But it's interesting to hear it applied to this context.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
So sometimes we kind of disconnect learning from power, but learning is about power. And that's kind of, it's about questioning power, redefining power. And like the STEM interests and so on are all good and interesting, but I think that kind of shift in power is what's kind of the key idea here. Does that?
Thank you.
Okay, so next steps. We're planning to create a localization toolkit so that different organizations, especially in the rec center kind of ecosystem across the country, could pick up if they want some of these practices and apply it. And we're also developing an equity-based framework. So the model that I showed there is the first part of that framework. We're also looking at assessment, which is another very, very thorny issue, especially in after-school programs, because the youth, we ran some surveys initially, and they hated the survey. There was almost like a evaluating that, and we have some exciting ideas that we're kind of working on right now. I'm happy to share in the future with you around assessments in these spaces. One more thing I want to say is that this project is as I mentioned, my community partner, Digital Harbor Foundation, they primarily offer learning experiences, equity-based learning experiences, but they are a very holistic organization. So they basically respond to community needs. And the project that I mentioned about community internet came out of this organization. A lot of the youth who were taking their programs, actually they started an organization to create internet service, free internet service in Baltimore City. And so while this might seem like it's a different domain from learning and kind of doing the community-based approach here, a lot of these principles apply, in my mind, to engaging community effectively in digital equity work. I'm not going to go into it because of time. I'm actually I'm out of time right now, but I'm happy to talk with you about this if you're interested. And I'm hoping that this could be also an opportunity for thinking how some of these practices could apply to the work that you're doing in your domains. Final quote is, we encountered the deep questions of design when we recognize that in designing tools, we're designing ways of being. So it's really important to think about what we're doing. Many thanks to students who participated in this work. I mean, none of this would be possible without their work, especially Erin Higgins really took the lead on this project. And also thanks to our community partner and the National Science Foundation for supporting this work. Thank you very much.
So we actually have another 20 minutes to engage in these conversations with all of you, Rachel and Foad, and any of our sessions from today to have some conversations around all of the great ideas that they raised. So I would love to open that up both to people in Zoom, to post in the chat box, but then to all of us here to ask those